The Halloween Garden Party Murders. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where shadows whisper secrets and truth hides behind elegant facades. I'm your host, Connor, and tonight I invite you to step into the world of Miss Jane Marple, that most unassuming yet brilliant observer of human nature. Before we begin our tale of deception beneath autumn leaves and lantern light, I'd love to know where you're listening from this evening. Drop a comment below and let our community span the globe together. Now, pour yourself something warm, settle into comfort, and let us begin our investigation into what happened on that fateful Halloween night at Ashford Manor. Chapter 1. Lanterns and Lies Among the Hedgerows. The October evening had settled over Ashford Manor with that peculiar quality of light that makes everything seem slightly unreal, as though the world itself were participating in the Halloween festivities. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her sensible wool coat and accepted the elaborately printed programme from a footman dressed as a Victorian undertaker, complete with top hat and mourning crepe. The manor's famous gardens had been transformed into a theatrical wonderland of carefully orchestrated fright. Carved pumpkins glowed along every pathway, their flickering candles casting dancing shadows across the manicured lawns. Artificial fog drifted artfully through the hedgerows, and somewhere in the distance, a string quartet played minor key arrangements of popular melodies with deliberate dissonance. Miss Marple had arrived as the guest of her bridge partner, Mrs. Constance Pemberton, who had been effusive about Lady Ashford's annual Halloween garden party. The event was legendary among the county's upper class, an elaborate trick-or-treat experience for wealthy families, where children and adults alike wandered through themed garden scenes, collecting sweets from professional actors hired for the occasion. Lady Ashford herself held court near the refreshment tent, resplendent in an Elizabethan queen costume that would have done the National Theatre proud. Her gown was cloth of gold with emerald velvet sleeves, and a jewelled ruff framed her imperious features. She greeted each guest with practised charm, though Miss Marple detected a certain tension beneath the gracious facade. The garden party stretched across 3 acres of grounds, divided into distinct scenes. There was a Victorian graveyard complete with marble tombstones and a fog machine, a witch's cottage where an actress in convincing makeup offered candy from a bubbling cauldron, and most impressively, an elaborate hedge maze that had been decorated to represent different rooms of a haunted mansion. Near the entrance, a pumpkin patch photo area invited guests to pose among enormous gourds and cornstalks. The orange pumpkins were magnificent specimens, clearly grown specifically for decorative purposes rather than culinary use, and their presence added authentic autumn atmosphere to the evening's entertainment. Miss Marple observed the various guests with interest. Families with children moved through the garden scenes with varying degrees of enthusiasm, the little ones clutching decorated baskets, while their parents sipped champagne and nibbled canapes. The costumes ranged from elaborate historical recreations to simple masks and cloaks, creating a surreal tableau of genteel Gothic fantasy. It was while admiring the witch's cottage that Miss Marple first noticed Marcus Thornfield, Lady Ashford's son-in-law. He was a handsome man in his early 40s, dressed as a rather dashing vampire in evening clothes and an opera cape. His wife, Lady Ashford's daughter Penelope, was beside him, costumed as a medieval lady, though her expression suggested she found her husband's flirtatious manner with the witch actress rather less amusing than he did. The evening proceeded with clockwork precision through its first hour. Children shrieked with delighted terror at carefully choreographed scares, adults exchanged gossip and business cards, and the servants moved efficiently through the crowds with trays of refreshments and fresh cocktails. Miss Marple had just accepted a cup of mulled cider when she noticed William Pratt, the head gardener, watching the festivities from a discreet distance near the tool shed. He was a weathered man of perhaps 60, with the powerful shoulders and calloused hands of someone who had worked outdoors all his life. His expression as he observed Marcus Thornfield was not one of employee deference, but something far more complex and troubling. Chapter 2. The Discovery in the Darkened Maze. The hedge maze had been Lady Ashford's particular pride, and Miss Marple had to admit it was impressively decorated. Each turn revealed a new Halloween tableau, a vampire's dining room with a table set for a macabre feast, a mad scientist's laboratory complete with bubbling beakers, a ghostly ballroom where spectral figures seemed to dance in the artificial moonlight. The maze's complexity had been enhanced for the evening, with additional temporary hedging creating false turns and dead ends. Several families were currently navigating its passages, their laughter and mock screams echoing off the yew walls. The effect was both charming and slightly claustrophobic, as the high hedges blocked out most of the surrounding illumination. Miss Marple had entered the maze with Mrs. Pemberton and a small group of other guests, following the orange lanterns that marked the suggested path. The narrow passages forced them into single file at times, and it was during one such constriction that they encountered a young chambermaid hurrying in the opposite direction, her face pale beneath her simple witch costume. The girl pushed past them without the usual servant's deference, and Miss Marple noted that she was crying, though trying to conceal it. Before Miss Marple could inquire if assistance was needed, the girl had vanished around a corner, leaving only the sound of her retreating footsteps on the gravel path. They continued deeper into the maze, admiring the increasingly elaborate decorations. The vampire dining room was particularly well executed, with what appeared to be genuine Georgian silver arranged on a mahogany table. Among the pieces, Miss Marple observed an ornate silver cake server with a wickedly sharp edge, presumably part of the theatrical display, but actual valuable silverware rather than stage property. It was approximately 7:35 when screams erupted from deeper in the maze, screams that lacked the performative quality of Halloween entertainment and carried genuine terror. The small group of guests froze, looking at each other with sudden uncertainty. A man's voice called out for help, and suddenly the evening's carefully maintained atmosphere of controlled fright collapsed into something far more authentic. Miss Marple and her companions hurried toward the sound, navigating turns and dead ends until they reached a small clearing near the maze's centre. Marcus Thornfield lay sprawled across a stone bench, his vampire costume now authentically bloodied. The silver cake server Miss Marple had observed at the vampire dining room was buried in his chest, and his sightless eyes stared up at the Halloween moon hanging above the maze walls. Lady Ashford arrived moments later, her Elizabethan gown rustling impressively as she swept into the clearing. Her face went white beneath her elaborate makeup, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might faint. Then the imperious manner reasserted itself, and she was issuing orders to servants, sending for the police, demanding that guests be kept calm and contained. Dr. Carstairs, who had been attending the party as a medieval plague doctor, made a brief examination and confirmed what was obvious to everyone present. Marcus Thornfield was quite dead, and the angle and depth of the wound suggested considerable force behind the blow. The silver cake server had been driven into his chest, with what Dr. Carstairs described as either desperate strength or practiced precision. Blood had soaked into the gravel beneath the bench and spattered across the nearby hedge, suggesting the attack had been swift and brutal. Inspector Davies arrived within 20 minutes, his practical mackintosh and trilby hat creating an odd contrast with the costumed guests. He began the necessary procedures with efficient professionalism, securing the scene and taking preliminary statements from those who had discovered the body. Miss Marple observed quietly from the periphery, noting details that others might overlook. The cake server had been clean of fingerprints, wiped hastily but thoroughly. Marcus's costume showed signs of a struggle, with buttons torn and fabric creased, but his hands bore no defensive wounds. Most intriguingly, his formal shoes showed traces of orange pollen, bright and distinctive against the black leather. Chapter 3. A Second Body. In the garden shed. The police had just begun establishing their investigation when a young constable came running from the direction of the utility buildings, his face pale with shock beneath his helmet. Inspector Davies listened to his breathless report and immediately dispatched additional officers toward the gardener's shed. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself near enough to overhear without appearing intrusive, caught the essential information. William Pratt, the head gardener, had been found dead in his workshop. The circumstances were being described as suspicious, though details were not yet clear. Lady Ashford received this news with what seemed like genuine shock, her hand clutching at her elaborate ruff as though suddenly unable to breathe. Her daughter Penelope, newly widowed though not yet aware of the full implications of her situation, was being attended to by friends and seemed too dazed to register this second tragedy. Inspector Davies, recognizing that he now faced something considerably more complex than a single murder, asked that all guests remain on the grounds until preliminary questioning could be completed. The Halloween festivities had transformed from entertainment to crime scene, and the decorated gardens now felt more genuinely sinister than any theatrical staging could achieve. Miss Marple, with that peculiar talent for being simultaneously unobtrusive and present wherever interesting events occurred, managed to position herself near the gardener's shed as the police conducted their initial examination. What she observed confirmed her growing suspicions that the evening's events were more connected than they initially appeared. William Pratt had been strangled with raffia garden twine, the natural fibre rope that gardeners use for training plants and securing stakes. The murder weapon remained around his neck, tightened with brutal efficiency. His body had been discovered by one of the catering staff, who had been searching for additional ice, and noticed the shed door standing open with lights burning inside. The scene suggested a confrontation that had escalated quickly. Tools were scattered across the workbench, and a paraffin lamp had been knocked over, though fortunately not broken. Pratt's calloused hands showed signs of having grasped at the twine, but the killer had maintained pressure until life departed. What immediately caught Miss Marple's attention was the presence of the same distinctive orange pollen she had observed on Marcus Thornfield's shoes. William Pratt's work trousers were dusted with it, bright against the faded brown fabric. Given that his duties would not typically bring him into contact with ornamental pumpkins during an evening garden party, this seemed significant. Inspector Davies was methodically examining the shed when Miss Marple ventured a gentle observation. The inspector, who had encountered Miss Marple during a previous investigation and learned to respect her insights, listened, with more patience than he might have shown another civilian. The orange pollen, she suggested mildly, appeared on both victims' clothing, yet neither the maze where Marcus Thornfield died nor this garden shed contained any pumpkins. The only significant collection of pumpkins was in the photo area near the manor entrance, quite some distance from either death scene. Inspector Davies looked at the pollen with renewed interest, then at Miss Marple with something approaching respect. The elderly lady's observation suggested both victims had been at the pumpkin patch relatively recently before their deaths, despite the considerable distance between that location and where their bodies were found. The timeline was troubling. Marcus Thornfield had been killed around 7:35, and William Pratt's body suggested death approximately 35 minutes later. 2 murders in close succession, using weapons readily available at each location, but with this curious connection of pumpkin pollen linking both scenes. Chapter 4. Whispers and Secrets in the Refreshment Tent. With the garden party effectively suspended and guests being interviewed in rotating groups, Miss Marple found herself in the refreshment tent with several other witnesses awaiting their turn with the police. The atmosphere was subdued, with nervous conversation replacing the earlier festive chatter. It was here that Miss Marple's particular gift for appearing harmless and encouraging confidences proved invaluable. The catering staff, less guarded than the family members, spoke more freely in her presence, and servants often saw things that their employers preferred to keep hidden. A young waitress, still wearing her Victorian serving-maid costume, mentioned to her colleague that she had seen Mr. Thornfield and William Pratt having what looked like an intense conversation near the pumpkin patch earlier in the evening. The exchange had seemed heated, with Pratt gesturing emphatically and Thornfield attempting to walk away several times. This information aligned with Miss Marple's growing understanding of events. She had observed during the evening that William Pratt had a daughter who worked as a chambermaid at the manor, the same young woman who had been crying as she rushed past in the maze. Miss Marple had noted the family resemblance in their features and posture. Further discreet inquiries revealed a story that was, sadly, all too common in households where wealthy men employed attractive young women. Marcus Thornfield had begun an affair with Sarah Pratt several months earlier, taking advantage of his position and her vulnerable circumstances. The relationship had resulted in pregnancy, and Thornfield had not responded with the honour that might be expected. Instead, he had pressured Sarah to terminate the pregnancy, offering money but no emotional support or acknowledgement of responsibility. Sarah, already devastated by her circumstances, had confided in her father, who had been equally devastated to learn of his daughter's situation and the callous treatment she had received. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the sadness of someone who had seen too many variations of human weakness and cruelty. The scenario suggested an obvious motive for William Pratt to confront Marcus Thornfield, and perhaps even to harm him in anger or desperation. However, Miss Marple's experience had taught her that obvious solutions often obscured more complex truths. The facts as presented suggested William Pratt had killed Marcus Thornfield in righteous anger, then been overcome with remorse and taken his own life. Yet the physical evidence did not entirely support this neat narrative. The silver cake server used to kill Marcus Thornfield had been thoroughly wiped clean of fingerprints, suggesting premeditation or at least enough presence of mind after the act to remove evidence. This seemed inconsistent with a crime of passion committed by a father defending his daughter's honour. Similarly, William Pratt's death, while it could theoretically be suicide, showed certain inconsistencies. The positioning of the body and the nature of the ligature marks suggested someone else had applied the fatal pressure, and the scattered tools implied a struggle rather than deliberate self-harm. Miss Marple requested more tea from a passing servant, and continued her gentle questioning of those around her. Lady Ashford, she learned, had been moving between different garden stations throughout the evening, ostensibly supervising the various actors and ensuring everything proceeded smoothly. This was characteristic of her management style, maintaining control over every detail of events at the manor. The timing of Lady Ashford's movements became increasingly interesting as Miss Marple pieced together various observations. Several guests mentioned seeing her near the maze entrance around 7:30, and again near the garden buildings around 8 o'clock. The gaps in her visible presence aligned rather too conveniently with the timing of both deaths. Chapter 5. The Evidence Hidden in Plain Costume. Inspector Davies had established a temporary command post in the manor's library, and Miss Marple had been invited, somewhat reluctantly, to share her observations. The inspector was beginning to recognise that the elderly lady's insights might prove valuable, even if he remained professionally sceptical of amateur detective work. The physical evidence was being catalogued with methodical precision. The silver cake server had been removed carefully and sent for analysis, though the thoroughness with which it had been wiped suggested fingerprints would not be forthcoming. The raffia garden twine from William Pratt's neck was similarly being examined, though its rough natural fibre made fingerprint recovery unlikely. What interested Miss Marple more than these obvious pieces of evidence was the orange pumpkin pollen that had appeared on both victims. Inspector Davies had confirmed through careful examination that the pollen was indeed from the decorative pumpkins in the photo area, not from any other source on the grounds. This meant both men had been at that specific location during the evening, likely in proximity to each other. Given the catering staff's observation of their heated conversation near the pumpkin patch, this suggested they had arranged to meet there, or one had followed the other to that location. Miss Marple had also been contemplating the nature of the weapons used. Both were items readily available at the locations where the murders occurred, suggesting either careful planning or opportunistic violence. The cake server had been part of the vampire dining room display in the maze, while the raffia twine was standard equipment in any gardener's shed. However, the clean removal of fingerprints from the cake server suggested more deliberation than pure opportunism would imply. Someone had been clear-headed enough after killing Marcus Thornfield to methodically remove evidence before leaving the scene. It was while considering these details that Miss Marple's attention turned to the various costumes worn during the evening. Elizabethan gowns with elaborate sleeves, vampire capes, medieval robes, all provided interesting opportunities for concealing small items or inadvertently collecting trace evidence. She requested, through Inspector Davies, the opportunity to examine Lady Ashford's costume more closely. The request was unusual enough that the inspector raised his eyebrows, but something in Miss Marple's expression convinced him to accommodate her. Lady Ashford was summoned to the library, still wearing her Elizabeth costume, though she had removed the jewelled crown. She submitted to Miss Marple's inspection with obvious irritation, clearly viewing this as both presumptuous and pointless. Miss Marple examined the elaborate sleeves with particular attention. The cuffs were edged with intricate lace and featured multiple folds of velvet and silk. Caught in the decorative slashing of one cuff, barely visible against the dark fabric, were several brown fibres. Using her small magnifying glass, Miss Marple identified them as natural plant fibre, consistent with raffia garden twine. The fibres were fresh, not weathered or degraded, suggesting recent contact. Lady Ashford's position as a lady of leisure made it extremely unlikely she would have legitimate reason to handle gardening supplies. More tellingly, Miss Marple observed Lady Ashford's shoes. The elegant period slippers, gold silk embroidered with seed pearls, showed soil on their soles. Not the gravelled garden paths where the party had taken place, but fine, dark soil consistent with a workshop or shed floor that saw regular foot traffic. Inspector Davies examined these findings with growing interest. Lady Ashford maintained her composure admirably, suggesting the fibres could have been picked up anywhere during an evening, spent supervising garden decorations. The soil, she claimed, came from checking various display areas throughout the grounds. Chapter 6. The timeline of deception. Miss Marple retired to a quiet corner of the drawing-room where evacuated guests were awaiting permission to depart. She requested paper and pencil from a helpful footman and began constructing a detailed timeline of the evening's events based on various testimonies and observations. Marcus Thornfield had been seen arguing with William Pratt near the pumpkin patch at approximately 7 o'clock, according to multiple witnesses. The exchange had been heated, but brief, ending with Pratt walking away toward the utility buildings and Thornfield rejoining the party guests. Between 7 and 7:30, Marcus Thornfield had been observed by various guests moving through the garden attractions. He had visited the witch's cottage, made inappropriate comments to the actress playing the witch, and proceeded toward the hedge maze. His wife Penelope had declined to accompany him, remaining instead near the refreshment tent with friends. The maze, with its complex turns and multiple dead ends, had contained perhaps a dozen guests at any given time during the evening. The lighting was deliberately atmospheric rather than practical, creating shadows and obscuring clear sight lines. It would have been relatively simple for someone to follow Thornfield into the maze without being obviously noticed. William Pratt had been observed by the catering supervisor, returning to his garden shed around 7:15. He had appeared agitated, walking quickly and ignoring greetings from staff members he passed. His daughter Sarah had been seen shortly afterward, also heading toward the utility buildings, though she claimed later that she had not actually entered her father's shed. Lady Ashford's movements during the crucial period were more difficult to trace. She had been here and there throughout the evening, as befitted a hostess supervising a complex event. However, several guests noted that she had been particularly focused on the hedge maze area between 7 and 7:30. One elderly gentleman, Lord Pembroke, mentioned casually that he had seen Lady Ashford standing near the maze entrance looking concerned, as though she had heard something troubling from within. When he inquired if assistance was needed, she had demurred, suggesting it was merely guests being overly enthusiastic with their Halloween screams. The timeline Miss Marple was constructing suggested Lady Ashford had been near the maze entrance around the time Marcus Thornfield was killed. Her explanation for being there, checking decorations and ensuring the hired actors were performing properly, was plausible but also convenient. More significantly, Lady Ashford had claimed to be dealing with a decoration problem near the garden buildings between 8 and 8:15. This was precisely the window during which William Pratt had died. When asked which specific decoration required attention, her answers had been vague, mentioning something about displaced props near the witch's cottage. However, the actress playing the witch, when questioned by police, reported no issues with her station's decorations during the entire evening. She had seen Lady Ashford pass by around 8 o'clock, but had not spoken with her or been aware of any problems requiring attention. Miss Marple added these observations to her timeline, noting the curious 15-minute gap in Lady Ashford's otherwise well-documented movements, a gap that aligned perfectly with when someone had strangled William Pratt in his garden shed. Chapter 7. The Forged Note and Burnt Evidence. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to an unusual detail during her time in the manor. The morning after the murders, while other guests were being interviewed and preparing to depart, she had observed smoke coming from the library fireplace, despite the mild autumn weather making a fire unnecessary for warmth. Lady Ashford had been in the library alone for perhaps 20 minutes before breakfast, and when Miss Marple passed by the room later, she noticed the distinct smell of burnt paper rather than wood smoke. This seemed curious enough to warrant investigation. Inspector Davies, when Miss Marple shared this observation, initially seemed inclined to dismiss it as irrelevant. However, he agreed to examine the fireplace ashes, and what emerged proved rather more interesting than either had anticipated. Among the thoroughly burnt remains were fragments of paper that had survived the flames. Careful sifting revealed portions of what appeared to be a handwritten note, though most of the text was destroyed. What remained legible included partial phrases, "cannot live with what," and forgive me for. The handwriting, what little could be analysed, appeared to be an attempt at William Pratt's characteristic script. However, the formation of certain letters showed inconsistencies with authenticated examples of Pratt's writing from his work logs and supply orders. Most tellingly, the paper itself was from the Manor's personal stationery, expensive laid paper with a subtle watermark, not the sort of utilitarian notebook that a gardener would typically use for personal correspondence. The ink was from a fountain pen using modern blue-black ink, while Pratt habitually used pencil for notes and simple ballpoint pens when ink was required. Inspector Davies examined these fragments with growing interest. A suicide note, he observed, would explain why someone might strangle themselves with garden twine, except that self-strangulation in that manner was essentially impossible, a fact that Dr. Carstairs confirmed when consulted on the medical practicalities. The note, therefore, had to have been written by someone else intending to stage Pratt's death as suicide following murder. The murderer had then realised, perhaps upon reflection or when attempting, to plant the note that the handwriting was insufficiently convincing and had destroyed the evidence. Miss Marple suggested gently that Lady Ashford, as mistress of a large household, would have regular occasion to observe William Pratt's handwriting on work orders, supply requests, and garden planning documents. She would know his characteristic script well enough to attempt imitation, even if the result proved unconvincing upon closer examination. The fragments, Inspector Davies noted, had been burnt very recently. The ashes were still warm when he examined them that morning, suggesting the destruction had occurred within hours rather than being old evidence from an earlier fire. Lady Ashford, when questioned about the library fire, claimed she had been burning old correspondence and household documents as part of routine organisation. She could not explain why this particular task had seemed urgent enough to undertake the morning after 2 murders, nor why she had chosen the library fireplace rather than asking servants to dispose of papers through proper channels. The inspector was beginning to see the pattern Miss Marple had already perceived. The attempted suicide note, the burnt evidence, the convenient gaps in Lady Ashford's timeline all pointed towards someone who had killed William Pratt and attempted to stage his death as remorseful suicide after murdering Marcus Thornfield. Chapter 8. The Angle of Attack and Defence. Dr. Carstairs, at Inspector Davies' request, provided a more detailed analysis of Marcus Thornfield's wound. The silver cake server had entered Thornfield's chest at an upward angle, striking the heart with what the doctor described as either remarkable luck or considerable anatomical knowledge. More significantly, the angle and depth of penetration suggested Thornfield had been facing his attacker when the blow was struck. The wound trajectory indicated someone shorter than Thornfield, which eliminated several potential suspects, but included both William Pratt and Lady Ashford among possibilities. However, Dr. Carstairs noted something else that Miss Marple found particularly interesting. Thornfield's body position, when discovered, suggested he had been turning away or stepping backward when struck. His posture was not that of someone simply standing and conversing with another person. The defensive positioning implied by his wounds and body placement suggested Thornfield had been aware of danger and attempting to avoid it. Yet his hands bore no defensive injuries, no cuts or bruises from attempting to deflect a blade or grab an attacker's wrists. Miss Marple considered this evidence carefully. A man facing attack with a deadly weapon would instinctively raise his hands in defence unless the assault came so suddenly he had no time to react. The angle of the wound suggested a thrust from below, the sort of blow that might be delivered by someone already crouched or kneeling. She shared her thoughts with Inspector Davies. If Marcus Thornfield had been the initial aggressor, perhaps shoving or striking William Pratt, the gardener might have fallen or been knocked down. The cake server could have been grabbed from the nearby vampire dining room display in desperation, used to defend himself as Thornfield advanced. Such a scenario would explain why Thornfield's hands showed no defensive wounds. He had not been expecting Pratt to have a weapon or to fight back effectively. The upward angle of the wound was consistent with someone on the ground striking out at an attacker looming above. Inspector Davies examined the crime scene photographs with this theory in mind. The gravel near where Thornfield fell showed scuff marks consistent with a struggle, and one of the decorative candlesticks from the vampire dining room had been knocked over, suggesting rapid, chaotic movement. If William Pratt had killed Marcus Thornfield in self-defence rather than premeditated murder, it cast the entire evening's events in a different light. Pratt might have confronted Thornfield about his treatment of Sarah, and Thornfield, accustomed to privilege and facing no real consequences for his actions, might have responded with physical aggression. The fight would have been brief but violent. Pratt, though older, possessed the physical strength of someone who had worked manually all his life. Thornfield, for all his wealth and position, would have been no match for a desperate man defending himself with an improvised weapon. After killing Thornfield, possibly not even fully realizing what he had done in the heat of the moment, Pratt would have panicked. He wiped the cake server clean of fingerprints, a surprisingly clear-headed action for someone in shock, and fled to his garden shed to collect himself and decide what to do. This was where Miss Marple believed Lady Ashford entered the story. She had been near the maze, had perhaps heard the confrontation or its aftermath. Upon investigating, she had discovered what had occurred and seen an opportunity. Chapter 9. The Lady's Cold Calculation. Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Inspector Davies in the Manor Library, away from other guests and family members. What she had to share required careful consideration of both justice and human complexity. Lady Ashford, Miss Marple explained, had spent her entire life maintaining the family reputation and social standing. The Ashford name carried considerable weight in county society, and scandal would damage not only the present generation but future prospects for marriage and social connection. When Lady Ashford discovered Marcus Thornfield dead in the maze and realized William Pratt was responsible, she faced a choice. The truth, if revealed, would expose that her son-in-law had impregnated and abandoned a servant girl, then died in a confrontation with the girl's father. The family would be tainted by association with both Marcus's behaviour and the violence it provoked. However, if William Pratt could be made to appear as a vengeful murderer who then took his own life in remorse, the narrative became more manageable. A crazed servant attacking his employer was unfortunate, but placed no moral stain on the family itself. It might even generate sympathy for the widow Penelope. Lady Ashford, Miss Marple suggested, had followed Pratt to his garden shed. She found him there in shock, possibly not even fully comprehending what he had done. The conversation that followed could only be imagined, but its conclusion was evident in William Pratt's strangled body. Lady Ashford had used the raffia twine, readily available in the shed, to strangle Pratt, while he was still disoriented and vulnerable. Her Elizabethan costume, with its elaborate sleeves and voluminous skirts, would have concealed blood spatter or transferred fibres until she could privately examine and burn any incriminating evidence. The forged suicide note had been her attempt to solidify the narrative of guilty remorse. She had composed it hastily, perhaps while Pratt's body was still warm, but upon reflection realized the handwriting imitation was insufficient. Better to have no note than one that raised questions about authenticity. Inspector Davies listened to Miss Marple's reconstruction with growing conviction. The physical evidence supported her theory. The raffia fibres on Lady Ashford's costume cuffs, the shed soil on her shoes, her unexplained 15-minute absence during the crucial time period, the burnt note fragments in the library fireplace. What troubled the inspector was the legal complexity of the situation. If Marcus Thornfield had attacked William Pratt first, Pratt's use of the cake server might constitute justifiable self-defence or manslaughter rather than murder. Lady Ashford's killing of Pratt, however, was unquestionably deliberate homicide, with no justification beyond protecting reputation. Miss Marple acknowledged this moral dilemma. Revealing the truth meant exonerating William Pratt of murder, while exposing Lady Ashford's cold-blooded killing. It also meant revealing Marcus Thornfield's treatment of Sarah Pratt, which would cause additional pain to both Penelope and the pregnant young woman. The question became not simply who was guilty, but what justice actually required. Inspector Davies, bound by his duty to enforce the law, knew he could not ignore evidence of murder, regardless of the social complications it might cause. Miss Marple suggested they confront Lady Ashford privately before making any arrests, allowing her the opportunity to explain her actions and perhaps provide additional details that might clarify the evening's events. The inspector, though sceptical of granting such courtesy to a murder suspect, recognized the wisdom of obtaining a confession before proceeding with formal charges. Chapter 10. Truth Beneath the Autumn Leaves. Lady Ashford received Inspector Davies and Miss Marple in the Manor's private sitting room, her composure as perfect as her elaborate coiffure. She had changed from her Elizabethan costume into a severe black dress appropriate for mourning, though whether she mourned her son-in-law, the gardener, or merely her shattered plans remained ambiguous. Miss Marple, with her characteristic gentleness that somehow made evasion impossible, explained what they had discovered: the orange pumpkin pollen connecting both victims to the confrontation site, the raffia fibres on Lady Ashford's costume, the burnt fragments of a forged suicide note, the convenient gaps in her timeline. Lady Ashford listened without interruption, her aristocratic features revealing nothing. When Miss Marple finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the whisper of autumn wind against the windows. Finally, Lady Ashford spoke, her voice controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something that might have been relief at no longer maintaining her deception. She confirmed with clinical precision what Miss Marple had deduced. She had heard sounds of struggle from the maze while checking decorations, had investigated, and found Marcus Thornfield dying with the silver cake server in his chest. William Pratt had still been present, standing over the body in obvious shock and horror. Lady Ashford, thinking quickly, had convinced him to leave while she summoned help, promising to explain the circumstances properly to protect Sarah's reputation. Pratt, trusting the lady of the manor and overwhelmed by what had occurred, had fled to his shed. Lady Ashford had then made her calculation. The family scandal could be contained if Pratt appeared to be a murderer driven by revenge rather than a father defending himself against Marcus's violence. She had followed him to the shed, engaged him in conversation about what would happen to Sarah if he were arrested and hanged, and while he was distracted and emotionally vulnerable, she had strangled him with garden twine. The suicide note had seemed necessary to complete the narrative, but her attempt at forging Pratt's handwriting had proven inadequate even to her own critical eye. She had destroyed it the following morning, hoping the physical evidence would be sufficient to suggest guilt-driven suicide without requiring written confirmation. Inspector Davies asked the crucial question: did she understand that she had killed a man who was arguably innocent of murder, who had defended himself against Marcus Thornfield's attack? Lady Ashford's response was chilling in its aristocratic certainty. William Pratt would have hanged anyway for killing her son-in-law, she stated. Her intervention had spared the county the expense of a trial, and spared Sarah Pratt the additional trauma of seeing her father publicly executed. Miss Marple observed that this rationalization conveniently ignored that Pratt might have been acquitted or received a reduced sentence if the truth about Marcus's behaviour and the self-defence circumstances had been properly presented. Lady Ashford had appointed herself judge, jury and executioner to protect family reputation, not to serve justice. The arrest, when it came, was conducted with the discretion appropriate to Lady Ashford's social position. She was permitted to arrange her affairs and write letters to her daughter before being taken into custody. The scandal she had killed to prevent would now unfold anyway, but with the added dimension of her own criminal culpability. Sarah Pratt, the young woman whose victimization had triggered the entire tragic sequence, was offered protection and support by the women of the parish, including Miss Marple. The baby, when born, would be raised with love rather than shame, a small redemption in a story otherwise devoid of consolation. Miss Marple, walking through the manor gardens in the days following these revelations, reflected on the layers of tragedy Halloween night had unveiled. The decorative pumpkins had been cleared away, the elaborate scenes dismantled, and the hedge maze restored to its usual austere geometry. Mrs. Pemberton joined her near the entrance to what had been the pumpkin patch photo area, now just an empty lawn awaiting winter's approach. The older woman had been profoundly shaken by the events, having introduced Miss Marple to what she had imagined would be a delightful evening of harmless entertainment. "I cannot comprehend it, Jane," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly. Lady Ashford always seemed so proper, so concerned with correct behaviour and maintaining standards. To think she could strangle a man with her own hands. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and gazed at the horizon where storm clouds were gathering. "That is precisely what enabled her to do it, my dear Constance. Her entire identity was bound up in maintaining appearances and family reputation. When those things were threatened, she possessed no internal compass to guide her toward genuine morality, rather than merely social propriety." The trial, when it came some months later, revealed additional details that deepened the tragedy. Marcus Thornfield had been heavily in debt from gambling and poor investments, facts he had concealed from his wife and mother-in-law. His treatment of Sarah Pratt had been part of a larger pattern of exploitation and casual cruelty toward those he considered beneath his social station. William Pratt's confrontation with Marcus had indeed begun as a father's attempt to demand his daughter be treated honourably. Marcus had responded, not with remorse but with contempt, suggesting that Sarah should be grateful for his attention and that her pregnancy was her own problem to solve. When Pratt persisted, Marcus had shoved him violently, and the older man had fallen against the vampire dining room table. The cake server had been within reach, and Pratt had grabbed it instinctively as Marcus advanced on him with clear intent to inflict further violence. The upward thrust had been a desperate defensive action by a man facing someone younger, stronger, and consumed with entitled rage. These facts, brought to light during Lady Ashford's trial, vindicated William Pratt's memory to some degree. The jury ultimately convicted Lady Ashford of murder, though they recommended mercy given her age and previous good character. She received a sentence of 15 years' imprisonment to be served in a facility appropriate to her health and social status. Penelope Thornfield, widowed and learning terrible truths about her late husband's character, retreated from society for a time. She eventually recovered her equilibrium and proved far stronger than her mother had assumed, establishing herself as an advocate for young women in service who faced exploitation by employers. Sarah Pratt gave birth to a daughter whom she named Grace, a declaration of hope and new beginnings. Miss Marple maintained correspondence with her, offering quiet support and occasional practical assistance that made life's path somewhat smoother. The Ashford Manor gardens were eventually reopened to the public on summer afternoons, though no Halloween parties were ever held there again. The hedge maze, scene of so much tragedy, was partially dismantled and redesigned into a simpler pattern that eliminated the dark corners where violence had flourished. Miss Marple, returning to St. Mary Mead after the trial concluded, carried with her the melancholy understanding that evil often wore respectable faces, and good intentions could corrupt as thoroughly as base motives. Lady Ashford had genuinely believed she was protecting her family, yet her protection had cost an innocent man his life and destroyed everything she claimed to value. The Halloween costumes and decorations had created an atmosphere of theatrical menace that evening, but the real horror had come from human choices made in service of pride and reputation. The elaborate facades, whether cloth of gold gowns or vampires' capes, had concealed not monsters but ordinary people capable of terrible decisions when their cherished illusions faced exposure. On quiet evenings in her cottage garden, Miss Marple would sometimes remember William Pratt's weathered face as he watched the party from a distance that final night. He had been a devoted father pushed beyond endurance, a man who had defended himself from violence only to be murdered for the crime of surviving. His memory deserved honour, rather than the shame Lady Ashford had attempted to assign him. The orange pumpkin pollen, that small detail that had first alerted Miss Marple to connections others missed, had long since blown away on autumn winds, but its significance remained, a reminder that truth often hides in the smallest observations, waiting for someone patient enough to see patterns others overlook. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, was a more complex matter than simply punishing the guilty or exonerating the innocent. It required understanding them, circumstances that created tragedy, the social pressures that distorted moral judgment, and the courage to expose comfortable lies that protected the powerful while sacrificing the vulnerable. The Halloween garden party murders had revealed all these uncomfortable truths beneath their surface of festive entertainment. 2 men were dead, 1 woman imprisoned, 1 young woman left to raise a fatherless child, and an entire family's reputation shattered despite all efforts to preserve it. As autumn leaves drifted across Miss Marple's garden path, she acknowledged that some mysteries once solved offered no satisfaction, only sadness at human capacity for self-deception and cruelty dressed as virtue. The truth she had helped uncover brought justice, but it could not restore what had been lost or heal all the wounds that Halloween night had inflicted. Yet she had done what her conscience required, following evidence wherever it led, speaking for the dead who could no longer defend themselves, and refusing to accept convenient lies that served the powerful at the expense of the powerless. If that meant comfortable illusions must be destroyed, so be it. The gardens at Ashford Manor would bloom again in spring, indifferent to human tragedy, life would continue its cycles, and people would tell themselves they had learned important lessons from these events. Miss Marple, with her clear-eyed understanding of human nature, suspected most would learn only that they should be more careful when concealing secrets, not that they should live more honestly in the first place. But perhaps Sarah Pratt and her daughter Grace, building a life from ruins, would find genuine happiness and integrity. That small hope, Miss Marple thought, might be sufficient redemption for a story otherwise steeped in sorrow and waste. Truth and justice were worth pursuing even when they brought pain, because lies and convenient fictions ultimately extracted a far higher price from everyone they touched. The Halloween decorations were long gone, packed away or discarded, but their symbolism lingered. Behind the masks and costumes, beneath the theatrical menace and playful fright, had lurked real evil wearing the most respectable of faces. Miss Marple had seen through those disguises to the truth beneath, and in doing so, had honoured the memory of a simple man who had deserved better than to die, protecting his daughter from the consequences of another man's cruelty and entitlement. Justice had been served, though not perfectly or completely. The truth had been told, though not without considerable cost, and Miss Marple returned to her quiet village life, knowing that she had done what was right, even when right was neither simple nor satisfying. Thank you for joining us tonight on Velvet Clues. The shadows of Ashford Manor have revealed their secrets, and justice, however imperfect, has had its say. I hope you'll return for our next mystery, where Miss Marple's keen observations will once again pierce through deception to find truth. Until then, I'm Connor, reminding you that the most dangerous masks are the ones we wear every day. Good night.